All right, let's jump right in. This is one of the oldest, biggest questions we've ever asked ourselves. What's the real relationship between our consciousness, our thoughts, our feelings, that little voice in our head, and the physical body that carries it around? Is your mind just a cool feature of your brain, or is it something else entirely?
Just give it a try for a second. Close your eyes if you want. Can you picture your awareness, your sense of you, just existing without your physical body? It's not that hard to do, is it? You can almost feel it. Well, what if I told you that simple little act of imagination was once used as the foundation for a huge philosophical proof?
Yeah, and the guy who thought this up was none other than René Descartes. He was convinced that this little mental exercise wasn't just daydreaming. He believed it was a logical key that could prove, once and for all, that your mind is totally separate from your body. In other words, that you have a soul.
Okay, so how on earth did he pull that off? Let's break down what we can call Descartes' imagination test. It all starts with a simple but really powerful rule about how to tell if two things are actually two separate things.
So, this is the heart of his whole argument, the conceivability rule. And, the logic here, it feels pretty solid, right? If you can picture one thing all on its own without the other, then they can't possibly be the same thing. They've got to be two different entities.
Let's put this to the test with a couple of really simple examples. Can you imagine your left hand existing without your right hand? Of course, easy, no problem. That's because they're two different things. Okay, now try this. Imagine a smile without a body. You can't really do it. I mean, you might picture the Cheshire Cat, but even then you're still picturing lips and a face. A smile isn't a thing separate from a body. It's something a body does.
And that brings us right back to Descartes' big move. He takes that rule and applies it to our first thought experiment. He says, since you can so easily imagine your mind floating around without your body, then they must be two separate things. And if your mind is this non-physical thing, well, what else could it be but a soul? It's a pretty elegant argument. But is it foolproof?
To really put this logic through its paces, we're going to take a little detour into ancient astronomy. We're going to apply Descartes' own rule to a totally different situation and see if it holds up.
For centuries, people would look up into the sky and they saw what they thought were two completely different brilliant stars. One would show up right as the sun was about to rise, and the other would appear just after the sun had set.
So you've got these two very clear, distinct definitions, right? I mean, they show up at different times in totally different parts of the sky. To anyone back then, it was just obvious they were two separate things.
All right, now let's run the Descartes imagination test. Can you picture it? Really try. Imagine a world where you go out at dusk and you see that familiar bright point of light, but then, when dawn comes, nothing. The spot where the morning star should be is empty.
Seems super easy to imagine, doesn't it? There's nothing about that little mental picture that feels weird or impossible. So, if we're playing by Descartes' rules, that leads us to one and only one conclusion.
And this is where things get really interesting. Because following that logic, it's going to lead us somewhere completely unexpected. According to the rule, since we can imagine one without the other, well, then they have to be two different things. The morning star and the evening star got to be separate. The logic is crystal clear.
Except Vermont.
Here's the big twist. The morning star and the evening star are just two different names for the exact same object, the planet Venus. It all just depends on where it is in its orbit when we happen to see it from Earth.
And just like that, our whole thought experiment falls apart. What we thought we were imagining, the evening star existing without the morning star, was actually us imagining Venus existing without Venus. And that is just plain impossible. So that foolproof rule, it led us to a conclusion that's totally, factually wrong.
Okay, so if the logic is busted for the stars, what does that mean for the original argument? The one about your mind and your body?
We've got this argument that feels so right, so intuitive, but we now know it can lead to a completely wrong answer. So where's the weak spot? Where did the whole thing break down?
Well, there are a couple of ways to look at this. First, maybe we just described what we were imagining all wrong. We weren't picturing a world where Venus didn't exist, we were just picturing a world where we couldn't see it in the morning. And that points to an even bigger problem. Our imagination, it can be pretty misleading. Just because something seems possible in our heads doesn't mean it's actually logically possible in reality.
And really, that's the key here. Descartes' proof just doesn't hold up. Because what we can imagine in our heads isn't always a reliable map of reality. It's totally possible that when we imagine our mind without our body, we're making the exact same mistake as those ancient astronomers. We're mistaking two different descriptions of one single thing for two separate things.
But here's the thing. Just because this one argument for the soul fails, that doesn't end the discussion, not by a long shot. For philosophers who came way before Descartes like Plato, the idea of a soul wasn't even the main question. They were already wrestling with something much, much bigger.
They were asking if the soul was immortal. I mean, it's one thing to say the mind is separate from the body. It's a whole other ballgame to say it can live on forever after the body is gone. So I'll leave you with this to chew on. Which question is actually harder to answer? Proving a soul exists in the first place, or proving that it's immortal?